Good evening and welcome. I'm Sassnet, Associate Director of the Bob Graham Center, and thank you so much for being here. What a great crowd tonight. We're very happy tonight to co-sponsor the Shorstein Lecture with the UF Center for Jewish Studies and the Samuel R. Budd Shorstein Professorship in American Jewish Culture and Society. After talk, there will be time for Q&A as usual, and we ask you to come to this microphone behind me because we're streaming and recording, and your question won't be picked up otherwise. I'll remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now Dr. Rachel Gordon, the Shorstein professor, is going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Gail. I'd like to thank Professor Connelly for his willingness to come out here from Berkeley. He's hard at work at another project, so we appreciate his taking the time to talk to us about this one. And I'd like to thank the Graham Center for hosting and Mr. Shorstein for making this possible. Professor Connelly will be talking to us about his book, From Enemy to Brother, The Revolution in Catholic Teaching on the Jews, 1933 to 1965. In his review of Connelly's book for the New York Review of Books, the historian of the Catholic Church, Gary Wills, wrote, "The history of Christian viciousness toward Jews is too grotesque for credence. As a character in a James McCourt novel says, in a very different context, I can't believe her, so I won't." Some Catholics at the Second Vatican Council said that the charge of deicide against the Jews was so silly it should not be dignified with a refutation. John Connelly, in his book, writes that the American Jesuit John Courtney Murray actually claimed that he had not heard the charge until he was 40. In the same way, deniers of anti-black prejudice in America forget that there was slavery, or say it was ended without after effects, or that it wasn't really so bad, no worse than, say, wage slavery up north. Slaves, after all, could not be fired from their jobs. The prejudice cannot recognize their own prejudice, as one cannot taste one's own saliva. The persecution of Jews by Christians has a vast and deep history. But in 1965, the Second Vatican Council declared that God loved the Jews. How and why that happened is Connelly's subject.
Thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you. So the subject that I'm going to talk about this evening is the subject of the book. You can see the book's cover. It's about how the church turned away from a particular teaching, which is sometimes called, as a shorthand, anti-Judaism, in October 1965, as the culmination of an event called the Second Vatican Council. So anti-Judaism, what was it? To simplify greatly, you can say that it had two components. First, the idea that God was punishing the Jews for killing Christ. This is the so-called crime of deicide. And second, that unless Jews became Christians, punishment upon Jews would last till the end of time. Now, I realize the book appeared a number of years ago, so I've spoken about it a fair amount. I know that such words sound extremely strange in our society. They sound like an incantation or words from some ancient, forgotten prayer, an old curse, as remote as possible from the language and sensitivities of our day. But until 1965, these two components were in fact part of what Catholics call tradition, a set of teachings going back to the early church. According to the new teaching adopted in 1965, the message was basically the opposite. Here are some of the actual wording from the document. By the way, the council, 2,000 bishops in one space. Message is basically the opposite. I've given you some of the actual wording. Nostra Aetate is the Latin for this document passed in 1965, meaning in our time. It's the Declaration on Non-Christian Religions. Section from Part 4 on the Jews reads as follows. God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers. He does not repent of the gifts he makes or the calls he makes. Thus, in this new teaching, the Jews are the only people, only religion about which the Catholic Church says specifically that they're an object of God's love. And it says that this situation, that God's love resting upon the Jewish people, will last forever. Why? Theologically, why? Why was that the teaching? It was because of the Jews' heritage, because of their fathers and mothers, we would now say, because of who they were and are, because of their being Jews. It was no more complicated than that. So you have to wonder, how is this possible? How could a church make such an about-face? In fact, I sometimes called it a 180-degree turn, if its teachings are said to be consistent. In fact, supposedly unchanging and without error. Well, part of the answer is that there was a kind of fine print regarding the old teaching that often eludes the layperson. For example, there was a story in the New York Times last October, which the Times was recalling this event in 1965. And so it's the Sunday Times. This is October 29th of last year, so it was recalling an event from the 1960s, October 29th, 1965. So what the Times summary of that event was as follows. Pope Paul promulgates 5 council documents, one absolving the Jews. As part of a declaration on non-Christian religions, Pope Paul VI enjoined Catholics from depicting Jews as rejected or by God or accursed, the Times reported. It was a doctrinal about-face for the Church, which had for 19 centuries held that Jews were collectively guilty for the crucifixion. In fact, this old teaching, this traditional set of views, was not a doctrine of the Church, technically speaking. It was never proclaimed as magisterial, a teaching of the Church's authority, its magisterium, let alone infallible teaching. This anti-Judaism was indeed tradition, but as part of tradition, it was open to interpretation. The tradition, by the way, consists mostly of so-called patristics. So these are the original church fathers, St. Jerome, St. Augustine, etc. And this tradition, certainly by the 1960s, had centuries of mass behind it. We might also say an inertia. But it was interpretation, and this interpretation, it was open to reinterpretation. So what the Church did, or more precisely, I argue in the book, what the advisors to the bishops of Vatican II did, was read in a new way even more ancient and authoritative texts than the patristic text, than the tradition, than the text of the Church Fathers, namely Scripture, especially the epistles of St. Paul, in light of the times in which they lived, the 1960s. They read it in light of in the darkness of the shadow of the Holocaust. These advisors to the bishops, these theological advisors to the bishops operating at the Second Vatican Council, are the people upon whom my book is focused. That is, the advisors and the advisors of the advisors, small groups of men and women, highly educated in Scripture, who produced the new ideas and language in that 1965 texts, and who give the story of my book its drama because of who they were. For the time being, I'll just say that they were a very unusual group of Catholics. And they practiced a very unusual and difficult craft, namely theology. But I, the person who wrote about them, the historian, am not a theologian. And my original intention was not to write about theologians or theology. Theology, you may know, is a very strange craft that deals in such things as eschatology, the teaching about the end of times, which, as you could see from my brief description, is central to the new teaching which talks explicitly about the eternal blessing, a situation that is supposed to last until the end of time, the eternal blessing upon the Jews. But I think it's safe to say that such thinking is as remote as one can imagine from the concerns of the people of today's church. The problem of theology and of Vatican II itself is that it uses a language that most people find hard to comprehend, let alone understand, as a basis of inspiration. And think about it. What is the point of church teaching that cannot inspire the people of God? And Vatican II says that the church is the people of God. With that problem in mind, I want to return to the original interest I had when undertaking this work in 2002. It was supposed to be originally an investigation of Catholics and other Christians who took lessons from their faith and applied them to acts of charity, to aiding people threatened by the racism and anti-Semitism that spread across Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. My assumption was that there was a relation between such acts of charity, sheltering of Jews, for example, and particular understandings, particular commitment to Christianity. And that if one went back to the texts of that time, that is, the writings of the 1930s and 1940s, one could find some interesting elaboration of these ideas, of Catholics and other Christians providing an intellectual and theological bulwark set against chauvinism. A further assumption was that Catholic theology was a resource from which arguments could be easily assembled to combat chauvinism and hatred. After all, what is the most basic teaching that people associate with Christianity? It's read once a year from the three synoptic Gospels in Catholic churches, usually in the fall. Last year it was in October. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Interestingly, in the church that I go to in Berkeley, when the celebrant was giving the children a blessing this past October before they went to Bible study, he said precisely this: "Listen carefully to what you hear and commit yourselves to living it." I think many of us have this kind of expectation that behind good acts of charity, stand people who have absorbed teaching in a particular way, perhaps when they were children. At the outset of my research, I was curious about Poland, because this is a Catholic country and also because I am a historian of Poland. In the 1930s, Poland was a place where Jews were under severe duress, which of course became genocidal after 1939. Of course, we all know about anti-Semitism among Polish Catholics. But having studied in Poland in the 1980s, I knew about a stream of liberal Catholicism of the post-World War II period, associated with people who are little known in the US, but who are outstanding public figures in Poland. For example, Jerzy Turowicz, Stanisław Stoma, Józefa Hennelowa. These people and others were friends, for example, of my Berkeley colleague, whom I knew briefly, Czesław Miłosz, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1980, a liberal Catholic, who went to the same church that I mentioned to you a moment ago. And these people were very well known to John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, formerly Cardinal of Krakow, who, as you may know, for all his reputation in the US as a conservative, in Eastern Europe counted as a liberal. And in the Polish context, a man of great eloquence and tact in Christian-Jewish encounters. I also knew about rescuers, people who had risked their own lives in Poland to shelter Jews. I assumed that they must have shared some common theological perspective with these tolerant Catholics and were open to ideas of solidarity with people of other faiths and ethnicities, particularly with Jews. I also knew that the Vatican had condemned racism in the 1930s, and so there were, beyond Scripture, pronouncements of the highest church authority of that time as ammunition to use against racial intolerance. But when I began reading Polish Catholic literature during a long sabbatical, I found nothing at all. Heroic figures of the post-World War II period were either silent, like Jerzy Turowicz, or were basically various kinds of nationalists. Stanisław Stoma, whom I just mentioned, heroic figure, by the way, in the post-war period, who worked for reconciliation between Poland and Germany, though he wrote in the 1930s as a young man in Catholic periodicals, insisted upon approaching the subject from the perspective of what he called the Polish interests of state. And from that perspective, Jews were a foreign ethnic group living in Poland whose interests had to be opposed. There was not a word in what I read in these Polish Catholic journals about Christianity or Christian teaching. So that leaves open the question of what kind of theology, and I'll come back to this, what kind of religious thinking was motivating Catholics who became rescuers in Poland and indeed elsewhere in Europe in the 1940s. So I expanded the search to other European countries, and what I found was where there was strong Catholic criticism of racism and anti-Semitism in the 1930s, that criticism tended to come from France and Austria. In Parisian and Viennese publications, there were refutations, elaborate refutations of Nazi racism, but there were also critiques of Catholic racism. That is, there were critiques by Catholics of other Catholics, of Catholics who were propagating racist views, especially in Austria. There were two interesting things about this group, that is, of this former group, that is, the vocal critics of racism from within the church. The first is that, and this is really a startling discovery, virtually every one of them was a convert to Catholicism, although converts in the church as a whole are probably less than 1% of the population. Two major figures, John Österreicher, who is shown here, and Karl Thieme, whom I'll talk about. But they operated with a lot of other people who virtually all were converts. That's interesting is that they had dynamic upward careers in the post-World War II period. They became advisors at Vatican II and helped formulate that new teaching on the Jews that I mentioned at the outset. In 1961, John Österreicher, he's the master, was taken on as a theological advisor at the Second Vatican Council. Before I tell you about the theological arguments against anti-Semitism that Österreicher and his friends made with material drawn from the Christian tradition, let me tell you a bit about their backgrounds. John M. Österreicher, originally Johannes Österreicher, was born in February 1904 into the home of the Jewish veterinarian Nathan, or Natan, and his wife Ida, in a place called Stadtliebau, which was a German language community in Moravia, today's Czech Republic, at the southern edge of what became known as the Sudetenland, that is the German-speaking areas of what is now the Czech Republic. At the age of 10, he began attending the gymnasium, or the high school, in nearby Olmütz, today Olomouc, and it was here that his lifelong interest in Christianity began. One day, we don't know exactly when, in 1917 or 1918, young Johannes Österreicher happened upon a thin volume excerpting the Gospels, Worte Christi, or Christ's Words, in a bookstore near his school. He took the book home and read it in secret, hiding it from his family. The ironic thing about this booklet is that the editor of the compilation was Houston Stewart Chamberlain. We know that Judaism was important to Österreicher as a form of identity in these years. When he began exploring the teachings of Christ around the time of World War I, he was the elected representative of the Jewish boys at his high school, as well as an enthusiastic participant in left-wing Zionist scouting. After gymnasium, Österreicher moved to Vienna to study medicine, but was not baptized until 1924. As you can see here, he became a Catholic priest, ultimately. He was baptized by this man, Father Max Josef Metzger, who was later arrested and executed by the Nazis for subversive acts. He was somebody who actually was joining with other conspirators against the Nazi regime to try to formulate plans for post-war Europe, and this is in Berlin, a so-called Stolperstein, or a tripping stone, before the place where he lived, indicating he was arrested and when he was executed. So this is the man that brought Österreicher into the Catholic Church. He's remembered in retrospect after World War II, in particular for being a pacifist and an early practitioner of ecumenism, which was not a well-practiced art in those days. That is, he argued for reconciliation with the other Christian churches. Now, once Österreicher was a Catholic, he decided quickly to become a priest. He was ordained a year ahead of time, ahead of everybody in his class. He spent a few years working in Catholic youth work, again with Father Metzger. I think in this Catholic youth work, he was undoubtedly aided by his experiences in Zionist scouting. But after that, especially after the rise of Hitler in Germany, he devoted himself to what became his life's work, what he called at that time a mission to the Jews, or as he later described it after Vatican II, an encounter with the Jews, an encounter of the church with the Jews. In 1934, Österreicher took charge of the mission to the Jews of the Diocese of Vienna, where he remained a priest to the end of his days, 1993. So we have the odd fact that the person who, in my view, was most instrumental in taking the church away from the view that Jews must become Christian in order to avoid punishment, to one according to which they are loved by God simply as Jews, became began his public career as publisher and author as a leading Catholic figure trying to make Jews into Christians. Österreicher collaborated with a number of thinkers, including Jacques Maritain, Dietrich von Hildebrand. These are famous Catholic philosophers of that time. But most important among his collaborators was a convert from Protestantism whom I mentioned above, Karl Thieme. Originally from a Protestant family from Dresden, in 1924, as a young man, Thieme shocked his family by the Social Democratic Party of Germany. Why do I say shocked? Because the Social Democratic Party of Germany at that point was still under the influence of the teachings of Karl Marx. And then in the mid-1920s, he finished studies at Leipzig in history, theology, and philosophy. He was multilingual, just as Österreicher was, very well educated. But he was so serious about this Marxism that the Social Democrats of his town in eastern Germany chose him to give an address celebrating Karl Marx on the 50th anniversary of Marx's death. That would have been March 14th, 1933. The event, as you can imagine, did not take place. Instead, during the night before this intended celebration of Marx, the Gestapo hauled the city's Marxist social democratic politicians out of bed for all-night interrogations, also apprehending Thieme and placing him in protective custody. After he was released from custody, Thieme converted to Catholicism in the Liebfrauenkirche in Leipzig-Lindau. Why? It had to do with the practice in the German Protestant Church at this point of disqualifying pastors of Jewish descent from the active ministry. That is, Jews who had converted to Christianity at any point, even in past generations, could no longer serve as ministers. This, in Thieme's view, had the effect of desacralizing the church, of making it unholy. So Thieme's collaboration with Österreicher was initiated in 1935 by one of those situation from that time that when I tell you about it will make the time seem even more distant than it is. A leading Jesuit of that time, a priest named Bichelmeier, had just proclaimed that even if Jews were baptized, they were not fully proper Christians. Why not? Because in Bichelmeier's view, they still maintained traces of a biological deformation caused by the apostasy, the supposed turn from God of their ancestors. He actually spoke of morally damaged genetic material. Erbmasse is the German word, which meant that, in his view, Jewish converts had to work on themselves over several generations in order to overcome these inherited defects so that their descendants might hope to become proper Christians. Karl Thieme wrote that this was nonsense, out of keeping with church teaching as well as with science. He made 2 points in a journal published by Österreicher in Vienna. First, the question of whether or not to support the anti-Semitic spirit of the time was a decision for or against Christ. One could not reject Jews and accept Christ. Tell me what your attitude is toward Jews, Thieme wrote, and I will tell you what kind of Christian you are. Second, Christians' primary task was not to proclaim Jesus to the Jews. Rather, their task was to tell Christians that the Jew in their midst expects the fulfillment of the main command of Jesus, the new commandment, the command of love with an urgency that has never before existed. Österreicher had not been able to refute this Jesuit, Bichelmeier, directly and personally because Bichelmeier was also a man, odd as it sounds, who worked in the Viennese mission to the Jews, and with whom Österreicher had a close personal friendship. He actually called him Du. He never got to the stage of calling Karl Thieme Du, for example. So one of the figures involved in leading, in a leading way in Vienna's Catholic mission to the Jews, believed Jews were not really ready for baptism. This case gives a sense of how widespread racist thought had become in German and Austrian Catholicism. Beyond writing various pieces refuting racism of their period, Karl Thieme as well as John Österreicher were active politically. They conspired in 1939 and 1940 with other Christian emigres, including the former Chancellor of Germany, Catholic Hans Wirth, to involve the Vatican, the papacy, in the struggle against Nazism as a racist ideology. they concocted one plan to cause the Pope to announce an international aid effort for persecuted German Jews. So a Sunday collection for persecuted German Jews in churches throughout the world, announced by the Pope just after the Kristallnacht pogrom of November 1938. Another idea they had was to cause the Pope to release German Catholic soldiers from their oath to Hitler. As you may know, German soldiers swore a personal oath of allegiance to Hitler. Neither of these plans succeeded. Instead, Pius XII, the Pope of that time, from early 1939, practiced appeasement. In June of 1939, Österreicher wrote to Karl Thieme, "It is beyond understanding that Pius XII, after all his diplomatic experiments as Cardinal State Secretary, up until January 1939 he was the Cardinal State Secretary, have failed, and he is still attempting diplomacy and not preaching the truth." So they were urging the Church not to be silent. Yet in these attempts to generate solidarity with the Jews, Österreicher and Thieme themselves had an ulterior motive. The hope was that Jews would become Christians. Thieme reckoned that an unlikely and unexpected gesture of solidarity from the papacy would cause Jews to turn massively to the Catholic Church. So here we are back at this troubling and difficult subject of eschatology, the teaching of the end days. The forces of evil seemed so unrestrained in the Europe of the late 1930s that Österreicher and Thieme and Maritain and Hildebrandt and all of their friends believed that they could only point, the evils of Nazism could only point to the end of the world and an impending final judgment. Jews would have a special role in this final act of history. Their conversion would somehow coincide with and help launch the end of time. Österreicher and Thieme also thought that the sufferings of the Jews of their day were willed by God, a sign to repent. As Österreicher wrote, a sign for Umkehr, for a complete changing of their ways, total conversion. Karl Thieme wrote in 1937 as follows, "For the very reason that he called Israel to his own sonship out of all the nations of the earth, he also punishes it all the harder, according to Amos, for its sins. All the unspeakable misery of Israel only arouses God's irate love, which grows the greater the more Israel becomes, in part, obdurate against him, in arrogant pride, or bows in false humility to the letter of his law, whose spirit and meaning it continues to deny. Thus, these pioneers in developing new teaching against anti-Judaism at this point thought that anti-Semitism was somehow the enacting of divine will, of divine punishment." So what happened after World War II? The amazing thing is that nothing at all changed right away in theology. That is, in what professional theologians like Österreicher, like Thieme, taught about the church and its relation to the Jews. The exact number of dead was known in the summer of 1945. People were writing about 6 million Jews killed, but still the idea among Christian theologians of Jews being condemned persisted. Karl Thieme had fled Germany in 1935 and survived the war in Switzerland. Österreicher had made a hair-raising escape through Portugal to New York, and in the early 1950s became a professor at Seton Hall University in South Orange, New Jersey. Karl Thieme insisted as late as the summer of 1945 in his correspondence with Österreicher that the church must call Jews enemies in a theological sense. Österreicher was beyond this point, beyond this kind of language by this point. He objected to Thieme that after all Jews had suffered, such language would only close their hearts to Christ. Christians must call Jews brothers. Indeed, for Österreicher, Jews were his own family, and he was, by the way, throughout his life, in memory at least, very close to his family. Both of his parents were killed in the Holocaust. Perhaps Jews were brothers, Thieme responded, but in rejecting Christ they became God's enemies. Or was Österreicher denying that Christ was God? One could not, as he wrote, sweeten these elementary facts with pretty words. The point here was that theology, teaching, had to have an internal consistency and could not be altered by any event in history. And as he had maintained before the war, the only hope for Jews was to turn to Christ. So it's a difficult question how Thieme and Österreicher changed 180 degrees by the mid-1960s and brought the bishops of the Second Vatican Council with them, who supported the document Nostra Aetate with a vote of 2,221 to 88. Not only were there centuries of tradition behind this teaching, but as theologians, these men considered themselves scientists, Wissenschaftler, and if they arrived at a particular conclusion based on study and interpretation in 1935, why should the conclusion be different in 1945? The full answer is in the book, but I trace the change in their thinking to the opening of lines of communication after the war to other Christian thinkers, to Protestants, but more importantly to Jews, with whom neither they nor any Christian theologians had had any significant contact before 1939. So, for example, Karl Thieme, because of his continuing concern with racism, that by no means ceased to exist in Central Europe in 1945, was in personal contact after 1945 with many pastors as well as rabbis and intellectuals of post-war Germany in joint efforts to combat the after effects of Nazi education, especially in the younger generation. In one article, he made what you might call a theologically correct refutation of the old Christian view that Jews were lost, rejected for all time. This is an article of 1947 or 48. In this article, he used a passage from Mark's Gospel to support his theological argument. Just as Jesus, in a passage in Mark, had awakened a girl who seemed dead, so the Jewish people too, though seemingly dead, could also be raised. They would awaken when Christ came and commanded them to arise. One Jewish intellectual, whom Thieme had gotten to know, Martin Buber, was shocked upon reading these words, and had this to say in a letter written to Thieme from Jerusalem in June of 1949. I had been persuaded up to now that you were interested in real understanding with those religious Jews who have understanding for people acting as faithful Christians. But how should such understanding be possible if you identify spiritual life for the Jews with their readiness to be converted? I have my spiritual life in a direct contact to God and myself, and in addition I have my bodily life. I cannot believe that God would allow a Christian to question this fact, and equally I cannot believe that God would allow me to act this way toward a Christian. Judaism and Christianity stand united in the mystery of our Father and Judge, and therefore the Jew can speak of the Christian and the Christian of the Jew only in fear and trembling before the mystery of God. On this basis alone can there be genuine understanding between Jew and Christian. What Buber was saying was that Karl Thieme's anti-racism of the pre-war period was now insufficient. In other words, can you really have Christian love or any love for a person you feel represents a dead covenant, a useless set of rituals? Can a Christian, as a Christian, really subscribe to anti-Judaism? Before the war, to say that Jews could be converted was to undo the racist idea that they were forever lost. But now this argument itself revealed the persistence of a deeper problem, the belief that Jews were spiritually deficient as Jews. Of course, the real problem for Christians saying that Jews were beneath contempt was the obvious fact that Christ himself was a Jew. So thanks to exchanges of this kind, for the first time, Catholics got to know the Jewish point of view intimately. And one can ask, can one love one's neighbor as oneself if one does not get to know the point of view of the neighbor? They understood when they got to know the point of view of the neighbor that anti-Judaism caused pain, great pain, especially in the shadow of the Holocaust. And I think this recognition helped tease forth new perspectives from Scripture, from Christian Scripture. All the people that I study were attracted in particular to St. Paul's letter to the Romans, his last letter, the chapters 9 to 11, and they form the precise source for this new teaching. Three things in particular. That the church is from Judaism and continues to draw from it. The church she draws sustenance from the root of that well-cultivated olive tree. Second, that the covenant, God's covenant with the Jews, is always intact. Theirs is the sonship and the glory and the covenants. And finally, that God loves the Jews. This is the language from the the Vatican II document, God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers. He does not repent of the gifts he makes or the calls he issues. I argue in the book that Karl Thieme and his colleagues, working out of the southwest German city of Freiburg, that's where he settled in the post-war period, made this theological breakthrough to reading Romans in this new way about the year 1950. So that in Thieme's words, and this comes up very suddenly in his writing, Jews suddenly are portrayed in very different ways from everything he had ever written before that. He uses a word strange in German. He said that they were Gott wohlgefällig, very pleasing to God. And I also describe how this vision, this breakthrough, this theological breakthrough, was argued and defended through the 1950s. It also became the view of John Österreicher as well as other advisors to the bishops who drafted the statement of 1965. And in fact, you do see a very close relation between this new reading of Paul and the language of the church from 1965. So now that I've told you this story, which is really at the heart of the book, perhaps we could stand back and look at the whole development that I've been talking about from a bird's eye perspective. What do we make of it? How does it matter for 20th century Catholicism, for 20th century history, this revolution in theology? Recall my original question, which is about the relation between Christian teaching and Christian action. Who were the Catholics who had leading roles in assisting Jews during the war, giving them shelter in Poland or Germany, Hungary, Slovakia, or France? Who were these Catholics? Let me show you some photographs of them. Sister Matilda Getter of Warsaw. Here's another, Irena Sendler, also of Warsaw. Another Polish rescuer, Zofia Kosak-Sztuczka. Here's a major German figure in bringing assistance to Jews, Dr. Gertrud Luckner, and her dates. Here is a woman that she worked with very carefully and closely, Margareta Sommer, from Berlin. Here is a woman from Hungary, Margit Slachta. Here is another sister from Hungary, Blessed Sarah Salhazi. She was killed by Nazis in 1944. Here is a rescuer from France, Germaine Ribière, shown on a French postal stamp. Here is another French rescuer, famous for her use of bicycles in bringing around news of impending deportations. Marie-Rose Gineste. So the question is, what do these rescuers have in common? Anybody notice anything they had in common? They were women. These were the major Catholic organizers of shelter across Europe, Western to Eastern Europe, everywhere you look. If you're interested in Catholic efforts to rescue Jews, they somehow had women in leading roles. The question is, what motivated these women? I don't have a good answer. I should say I don't have an exhaustive answer, but there's a good book that appeared about 20 years ago called Cries in the Night, Women Who Challenged the Holocaust. And what you see throughout the stories in this book is that the women who are mostly trained in social work, Catholic women, they were motivated by a basic kind of empathy. So Matilda Getter, for example, the Polish nun I showed you at the very beginning, her working principle was her conviction that any child who came to one of her convents had been sent there by God. These simple, uncomplicated guidelines allowed Gettler and her sisters to act boldly and resourcefully in defiance of the Nazis. Margit Slachta, the Hungarian nun that I showed you earlier, she wrote in 1942 to her bishop, "My conscience tells me that I am an accomplice when I have not tried to do everything in my power to put an end to these acts." Helping Jews was based, she said, on the Christian principle of brotherly love, an obligation to Christ, and a patriotic devotion to Hungary. What we can be sure about the case of these women is that none of them, as far as we know, gave a thought to questions of eschatology. In the moments when they were taking money to remainders of Jewish communities in Germany or helping shelter Jewish children in France or Poland. And as I mentioned, they had a training not in theology, but usually in social work, virtually all of them. But I should also note that, and this is important to point out, that all of them were anything but non-religious. That is, they acted as Christians. They simply had a different idea of the relation of theology in theory and theology in practice than that held by, let us say, John Oesterreicher or Karl Thieme. So what did they do after the war, when the war was over, those that survived? Some of them did not survive. Well, one person that I've looked at pretty carefully is Gertrude Luckner. This one. She has a very interesting history, and I can only refer you to my book to find out more about it. Her activity during the war was to take money from the Diocese of Freiburg to the persecuted Jewish community in Berlin and try to get money to Jews there who were desperately trying to hold on. In one of these trips, she was arrested by the Gestapo and sent to Ravensbrück, where she spent the rest of the war and survived and was released in 1945. When she was released, she decided to devote the rest of her life to reconciliation between Christians and Jews. She was the only German present at a so-called emergency meeting that took place in 1947 of Christians and Jews. It was called the Salisbury Conference in Switzerland, that addressed the rise in anti-Semitic incidents in Central Europe of that period. Little known story, for example, in the years after World War II, of 500 German Jewish cemeteries, about 200 were desecrated, not during the war, but after the war. So this concerned some intellectuals on the Christian and the Jewish side, as well as the American, French, and British occupying armies. The meeting released something called the Salisbury Principles, this meeting that she attended, basic theses that guided the work of Christians and Jews after the war. I can leave this up. Sorry, there isn't really time to get into the details of that right now. These Salisbury Principles guided Christian-Jewish reconciliation after the war. In terms, what Luckner did is she set up something called the Freiburger Rundbrief, or the Freiburg, Circular. It was a bi-yearly publication that, in retrospect, well, these days seems like a treasure trove, because it was where scholars from both sides, so Christians and Jews, got together and tried to collaborate, figuring out ways out of this theological impasse. It also has lots of interesting stories about the early state of Israel, Christian attitudes toward it. It features Jewish authors as well as Christian. It's all online, by the way. If you read German, you can find out much more from this publication. So this is what Luckner did as her basic platform for reconciliation. She tried to overcome anti-Judaism through this bi-yearly publication. But guess who she chose as her absolutely indispensable advisor in the knotty questions of the theology of Christian-Jewish relations? This survivor of Ravensbrück. The person she chose was none other than Karl Thieme. So I could say somewhat irreverently that this is a case of an activist turning to a nerd for assistance. So this is a man who devoted his life to thought. He actually, in his free time, translated the Bible for fun, basically. This is something he enjoyed doing. He's an enormously gifted intellectual, but he was the person whom she found completely indispensable, basically developing this new set of ideas theologically. So he and she used the Freiburger Rundbrief as a platform for innovative theology in the 1950s. And she really needed him, he really needed her. So when I argue in the book that in a sense this journal, the Freiburger Rundbrief, became a testing ground for the soundness of the theology that ultimately formed Nostra Aetate. A testing ground because there's perhaps no place on earth with a higher per acre density of theological and philosophical opinion and expertise among Christians than German-speaking Central Europe. So week after week, criticism in the form of letters would pour in from people who suspected Thieme and Luckner of not holding the line of theological orthodoxy. And I can tell you that Thieme was a very hard-headed intellectual, and he roared back. There were a lot of very heated exchanges that took place. This is how this theology was tested against great opposition. As you may know, until 1949, the city of Freiburg in southwest Germany was in the French zone of military occupation, and indeed all of Germany was under military occupation until 1949. The Western Allies were watching this spike in anti-Semitic incidents that I mentioned a moment ago with some concern, and for that reason, in 1947, the U.S. military created something called Societies for German-Jewish Friendship in a number of German cities, consisting of Christian and Jewish representatives who were supposed to work out methods of combating the continued hostility, of the suspicion of about Jews among Christians. Before World War II, there was nothing like this in Europe. There was nothing like a joint committee of Christians and Jews in Europe. There was hardly any conversation between Christians and Jews in Europe for reasons that we could talk about. However, this form of interaction was not new to the U.S. authorities. In creating these societies in Germany of Christian-Jewish reconciliation, they fell back upon an organizational form that went back to the 1920s in the United States. In fact, to the year 1928, when Christians and Jews, I think mostly in the East Coast in the U.S., formed councils to combat chauvinism and bigotry that endangered them both. That is, they joined forces to fight against anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism. The U.S. was a different kind of place to be Catholic before World War II, in part, I think, due to the fact that there was no established church in the U.S., unlike Slovakia, Croatia, Poland, right? Catholics and Jews in the U.S. were immigrant communities and both faced hostility. Perhaps most important, unlike in Germany and Poland, there was no ethnic understanding of citizenship in the U.S. That is, Jews and Christians and people of whatever background could imagine each other as Americans in a way that Polish Catholics did not imagine Polish Jews as being Poles. That common citizenship gave them a common platform for a struggle against bigotry. They could argue from within their faith groups, and I think they did, but they could also argue as Americans. I say I think they did because this issue has not so far attracted much historical interest. One thing I do know from my travels talking about my book, about this very different situation in U.S. interfaith relations, is startling and extraordinary for its time. The 1920s and 30s were a time when leading U.S. institutions of higher education had a thinly disguised quota system against admitting Jews. That includes such places as Harvard, Yale, NYU, Michigan, Columbia, and many more places. And so Jewish students seeking higher education often applied to and attended, you would never guess what kind of universities and colleges, Catholic universities and colleges. Prominent among them were Providence College in Rhode Island. There's data here indicating spikes up to almost 20% of Jewish students in entering classes at Providence College in the 1930s. But also Providence College, the name doesn't indicate it, but it's run by the Dominicans. Marquette University in Milwaukee, run by the Jesuits also. St. Louis University, Loyola in Chicago. This is a partial list because the issue has not found its historian. The European situation was completely different. I just want to show you graduates of Providence College. This is Aaron Sloan, class of 1942. This is Abraham Smith, who was killed in action in 1944 in Germany, who would have been class of 1945, Providence College. The European situation is completely different. In Poland, authorities colluded in keeping Jews out of state universities. The authorities tended to be Catholics, and they felt they were, as I mentioned above, protecting Polish ethnicity, which was considered to be synonymous with Catholicism. But back to post-war Germany. Another interesting coincidence is that when the U.S. authorities set up these societies for Jewish Christian understanding in German citizens, they faced the question of whom they would choose as their theological advisor for these societies on a German-wide basis. Who was it in Germany whom they could trust to coordinate theological expertise across the map? Who was it that had a reputation as an anti-fascist? Well, the person that they chose to coordinate the efforts of these societies was none other than Karl Thieme. Here it has to be said that Germany in this period was a mostly Protestant country. I think to this day it's about, in terms of heritage, about 2/3 Protestant, 1/3 Catholic. And Thieme, as a former Protestant, he knew personally from his family a lot of Protestant pastors and was excellently acquainted with their theology, in most cases better than they were themselves. So in a sense, the need perceived by Catholics and Protestants to deal with the common heritage of anti-Judaism brought them closer together as Christians. It was ecumenical, in other words. So I have a few words of conclusion, and then we can perhaps move on to questions and discussion. So the first point I want to make is that it's really tough to know what to make of this story I've just told, this series of stories. It's not a simple story of heroism, that is, the path leading to Nostra Aetate, this event in 1965. Maybe it's not a story of heroism at all. The story that I've told could make one deeply skeptical about the practice of theology, indeed, the power of church teaching to influence change. The point is that today, as in the 1930s in the U.S., let us say at Providence College or Marquette University, or, more dramatically, in Central Europe in the 1940s, in those orphanages where Jewish children were given shelter, Catholics interested in more civil, more open, more peaceful relations with other people of other ethnicities and faiths, did not check with the church teaching authority, with the magisterium, to get direction. They did not ask about eschatological vision, which is crucial to the theological change, or whether their primary duty to Jews was to baptize them. They didn't know much, if anything, about the theology of Christian-Jewish relations, and they didn't care about it. And I think history shows that if they had, it did nothing to make them better Christians in the sense of people expressing Christian and enacting Christian charity. The second point is that Catholicism, as I've described it, is situational. It varies by place, by nation, by state. It's situational much more, I think, than current history writing acknowledges. History writing tends to talk about the church as if it were a monolithic institution, as if you could say, for example, the church was silent. I'll tell you that's almost a nonsensical statement. The church was a very varied institution. The idea that Jews were somehow genetically damaged was an idea that could prosper only in a particular variant of Catholicism, the Central European variant that was where the discourse, the political discourse, was deeply ethnicized and racialized in a way that was not the case in France, in the United Kingdom, or the United States. And arguably, this idea was not so much a theological idea as a particular kind of nationalism to which the church adapted itself in Germany and Austria. An ethno-racial nationalism that made use of theological ideas for its own purposes. But of course, within that part of Europe, Central Europe, where such ideas flourished, they were defended by top religious authorities. For example, as I mentioned, by that leading Jesuit figure in Vienna in the 1930s, Professor Dr. George Bichelmeier. Third point, still I think it's remarkable that the intellectual lead in dealing with the age-old tradition of anti-Judaism tended to come from Central Europe. Virtually all the people that I study who led to this new teaching were originally German-speaking. They were produced by a German cultural context, perhaps reminiscent of the way that the strongest antidote to a particular illness comes from the strongest strain of that illness. Karl Thieme and John Österreicher knew about all the aspects of anti-Judaism because they had been at its center. They had been part of it. They had subscribed to it in part. And they had found their way out. They understood all the problem's complexities, above all, that responding to racist anti-Semitism is not like responding to racism. In the case of racism, one can refute the prejudice by saying that the object, race, is a fiction. But they knew that the Catholic Church could not deny the reality of the Jewish people because the Jewish people was the Church's very origin. And the document at Vatican II, which is interesting for me at least as a historian of Central and Eastern Europe, calls Judaism not a religion. It uses the word, the equivalent in Latin for tribe, or in German word is Stamm. The Latin word is Stirps. So in other words, Judaism is religion, but it's more than religion. And the Church is very clear about that, the Church in this document. Point 4, that said, anti-Judaism before 1965 was something that could in fact affect anyone. within the church, no matter how well-meaning, whether they lived in Germany or the United States, when they sought in that period the deepest possible grounding for theological thinking. So the example that I have here is a Jesuit who was much loved in the 1930s and 40s, Catholicism, John Lafarge. Here's even a cartoon of John Lafarge. It's pretty accurate, at least of the way he looked. He was leading expert in the church of the 1930s in the U.S. on the race question. He wrote actually a book, here's his picture, called Justice, a study of the Catholic doctrine of race. He had been born into a renowned Catholic family in Boston among Brahmins. He had enjoyed a superb education in France and Austria before World War I. He was multilingual. He was very tolerant. He was liberal. His first assignment as a priest was in Maryland, a place with a strong African-American presence. That's where he became interested in race relations, and he retained that interest all the way to the end of his life. So he took part in the civil rights demonstrations of the early 1960s. This book that he wrote in the 1930s happened to catch the interest of Pius XI, the predecessor of Pius XII. And when Lafarge happened to be in Rome in the summer of 1938, Pius XI summoned him to an audience. You don't say no when the Pope summons you to an audience if you're a Jesuit. And in this meeting, he commissioned Lafarge to draft an encyclical, so a papal letter on the race question. But when the Pope gave him a charge to think about the subject that involved Christian-Jewish relations, Lafarge didn't really know much about the subject. He fell back upon the Church's tradition, which gave him very clear messages. And that is the draft that he produced for what was to be a papal. This unhappy people, destroyers of their own nation, whose misguided leaders had called down upon their own heads a divine malediction, curse, doomed, as it were, to perpetually wander over the face of the earth, were nonetheless never allowed to perish, but have been preserved through the ages into our own time. No natural reason appears to explain this indestructible coherence. So this would have become church teaching had the Pope survived, not died in January 1939. This is part of the so-called hidden encyclical. It was to be an encyclical against racism. This would have been part of it. This would have frozen, in a sense, church teaching with these words, had Lafarge's draft and the drafts of two other Jesuits made it. Fortunately, the successor to Pius XI, Pius XII, put this away. We don't know exactly why. But my point here is that this was the tradition that people found themselves resorting to, even people like Lafarge. So theology does matter. So that's my final point. Theology, as obscure and as absurd as it may sound, is something that the church cannot dispense with. Best case, I think, is Gertrude Luckner. If you're looking for a figure, here you have one. She knew there was something problematic. She sensed there was something problematic with the tradition, the Catholic tradition part, and she had to call upon an expert to deal with it. So in my view, this combination between, or this collaboration between Thieme and Luckner seems to say more about the roles of theology and engagement, political, if you will, engagement in charity than any I can think of. What is not clear is how much theology an ordinary believer requires. Perhaps it's a poor comparison, but let's take a different science. I said that theology is a science. Well, physics is also a science. Does an average believer require of theology the equivalent of the very basic knowledge an ordinary homeowner needs of physics in order to turn on a light switch? Or does he or she require something deeper, more the equivalent, let us say, of what a mechanic or engineer requires? What is clear is that theology is too important to be left solely to the theologians, because the life of what we call the church, and the Vatican II calls the church the people of God, the life of that entity depends upon theology. So with that, I will conclude, and thank you for your attention.
Who wants to be the first to ask a question? Come on up.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Connelly. First, I wanted to say thank you so much for taking time to come speak to us today. My question for you was, based on your findings, did you ever come to find that Pope Pius XII might have not actively been against the Nazis for fear of persecution as the Germans started taking over more and more of Europe?
Yes, so it's a complicated question. This gets to the failure of Pius XII, the Pope during the war. So from 1939 to 1958, Pius was the Pope. Pius XII was the Pope. He spoke out in France in 1935, and in an encyclical to the German churches in 1937, very clearly against racism. He's well known to have been appalled by the crimes that he was informed about pretty precisely that were taking place in Europe during the war. The question why he didn't speak out, condemn Nazism directly, had directly to do with his conviction that such a statement would cause the Nazis to move against the churches more generally and cause them to cease functioning in any regard. His primary concern probably would have been with the ability of the churches to carry out their spiritual mission, to carry masses, teaching of the faith and the like. But he also knew that Catholic convents and churches were sheltering victims of persecution, and that these victims also would have become victims of the Nazi regime had the church been robbed. And this by the way is my interpretation. The archives that would give us potentially sounder answer to the question have not been opened, but he was informed about the role of church institutions in giving shelter to people persecuted by the Jews. So he must have also understood that the closing of these institutions would have risked the lives of these people. So that would be my answer.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our scripture study group is currently going through the letter to the Hebrews, and most of us were essentially inculcated in post-Vatican II theology and attitudes, so that it was a little bit uncomfortable in reading it in the sense that the whole letter essentially postulates what's called supersuccessionism, the idea that the covenant with Christ supersedes the law of Moses and so forth. And of course there are other examples in John and whatnot, and you really haven't touched on them, but I'm curious, maybe you know, maybe somebody else knows, how did the congregation at Vatican II deal with these incongruencies?
Well, this is interpretation. We don't have a record of an active concern with Hebrews. There was actually at the very end of the council there were some more conservative people brought into the committee that was dealing with the formulation of the document. One French Jesuit, I believe, named Benoit, for example, I think he was very concerned about the letter to the Hebrews. Ultimately, it was not thought to have the status of Paul's letter to the Romans. That's my understanding. Letter to the Hebrews authorship is unknown, as you probably know. It used to be attributed to Paul, but it's no longer the case. In Romans, this is Tima's own interpretation. Carl Tima said that there are sections also in Paul's earlier letters that would cause one to believe supersessionist, meaning supersessionism, by the way, means that the church has superseded Judaism, that Judaism has lost its connection to its divine mission, that it's been superseded by the church. So Carl Tima argued in the Freiburger Rundbrief in the 1950s that because it was Paul's final letter that represented the highest level of his thinking. And so you don't find supersessionism in Romans. It's pretty clear. There's the talk of God's promises not being repented. In other words, God not undoing promises made to the Jewish people. And that's very clear, and it's clearly an internal struggle going in within Paul to make sense of the fact that most Jews were not following the teaching that he was developing. What John Pawlikowski, a modern theologian who was the leading American specialist in Christian Jewish affairs, has said is that the drafters of Nostra Aetate found that in light of the experience of the Holocaust, that the message that Hebrews again did not have the status of Romans. But there is good. I'm, as I said, not a theologian, but I would urge you to look, and it's easy to find these days. It's one of the virtues. I don't think there are necessarily that many of the internet, but one of them is that you can go into Google. And if you Google John Pawlikowski, he spells it in the Polish way. So it's Pawilk, Pawlikowski, John. He's a professor, a renowned theologian who teaches in Chicago. He deals precisely with this question of what to make of the letter to the Hebrews. There are also books that deal with questions of Christian-Jewish relations. If you write to me at Berkeley, Berkeley History Department has my email address. I can send you the citations. But this is really an issue that is a high level. I mean, I'm impressed that you're going to a scripture study group. This is something that one encounters at this level. There is good guidance. So Pawlikowski is one. There was a theologian at Boston College whose name's escaped. I remember now. Daniel Harrington. Daniel Harrington was also a brilliant Jesuit theologian, professor of theology at Boston College, a scripture scholar of great renown. Daniel Harrington wrote a book called The Gospels Set Free. It's about the synoptic gospels and how to read apparently anti-Judaic statements in the synoptic gospels, so that's Mark, Matthew, and Luke, without the old anti-Judaic overlay. So the argument is that this anti-Judaism was placed upon the gospels and the epistles after the fact by successive generations. So Daniel Harrington. There's also a book about John. I'm sure there's something about Romans and about Harrington also wrote about the epistle to the Romans. So that would be my response as a non-theologian. What you've identified is a real issue, but there are theologians who have addressed it, and I would commend you to them.
Thank you, Professor Connelly. Did your studies allow you to see any differences between Protestants and Catholics in this what you all talked about?
Well, yes. It's an interesting question. Yes and no. So I would say there were liberals among the Protestants, and there were liberals among the Catholics, and there were conservatives among the Protestants and conservatives among the Catholics. The only thing that was different during the war was that there was central control of the Catholic theology by the Vatican, which did not permit a splitting of the German Catholic Church, for example, in the way that German Protestantism split. So German Protestantism actually developed a very large, influential segment called the German Christians, who essentially tried to reconcile Nazi racial thinking with Christian theology, going to the extent of portraying Christ as an Aryan. So this is something that was not tolerated within the Catholic Church. But there were, as I mentioned a moment ago, in Vienna, in Austria, but also in Germany, there were Catholic theologians who reached essentially racist points of view. So I would say that in both churches you have essentially have tendencies toward racism. In both churches you have opposition to racism. So I guess it's interesting. I hadn't thought about this question before. My overall thinking would be that the people who were on the more liberal side, they tended to be closer to each other, almost theologically, than to their brethren and sisters within the church. And the people who were more conservative, that often meant, in the German context, nationalist, they were closer to each other as well. So that, for example, Carl Schmitt was a German Catholic thinker. I think he would have felt better in the company of Deutsche Christen, so these German Christians, than he would have among people like Max Joseph Metzger. So that would be my
Okay, thanks.
answer.
Hello, Professor. My name is Daniel Greenstein. My mother was Rachel Engelstein. She was a hidden child in Belgium. She was raised as a Catholic. Her parents, my grandparents, dropped her off at a convent in Belgium, Louvain, when she was 7 years old. They changed her name to Marie-Rose Dupont. She traveled through different convents and was hidden by different priests and different nuns throughout the war. So I was just wondering if you were familiar with the network in Belgium, because I read a book by Suzanne Vroman specifically about the nuns and the priests in Belgium who seem to have almost a network to hide these kids and go from church to church. And it's documented the same stories that my mother tells when she was taken at night from place to place. and raised as a Catholic. And this book that I found kind of mentioned that for some reason in Belgium this was a specific kind of network. I don't know if you're familiar with
Can I ask you a question?
Go ahead.
So, what was your mother's relation to her Judaism? You said she was raised a Catholic. Did she then?
Okay, so my grandmother survived Auschwitz. My grandfather was killed probably on the first day. So they were captured by the Gestapo in Brussels and sent to Malines, to the train station. So my grandmother survived and somehow was liberated by the Soviets and ended up back in Brussels and searched for my mother and found her in one of these refugee camps or Ort school. My mother always knew she was Jewish, but she knew that she had to, go to Mass and to learn all the prayers but when she realized, she was very angry at her parents for giving her up, but when she realized why they did it, she definitely rediscovered her Judaism, and she was very active in Jewish causes, Ort and Hadassah and different Zionist causes. Unfortunately, she passed away quite a while ago, but I was raised with, the war was never over in my house, and the people who hid her, I knew these people. We'd go to Belgium and we'd meet them, and they're recognized in the Garden of the Righteous at Yad Vashem.
This is not isolated to Belgium. Such networks existed in Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, France. There's good information also about Italy in this regard. I don't know of a book that would, I'm relying upon books the way that you are, and I don't know of a good book that would tell you the whole story across Europe of these rescue operations. But I think that they were pretty similar across boundaries. What is interesting in this book that I mentioned in my talk, Cries in the Night, is precisely about women in Poland and Hungary who organized these networks, is that the nuns apparently were very, very careful that when liberation came, that the Jewish children were informed, after having behaved as Christians for several years, that they were in fact Jewish and should return to their families. Even if their parents were killed, they would go back to their families. There's a story, a very sad story of an eminent historian of the Holocaust named Saul Friedlander, who teaches at UCLA, who was hidden by Jesuits, I believe, during the war after his parents were taken to Auschwitz from France. And he actually wanted to become a Catholic priest until at one point Jesuit called him into his office, closed the door, and said, "Listen, you have this other background." And that was, and it's almost as though he reawakened to his true self, if one can say that, and went, and then, as you know, was as is known, he then went to Israel, was trained as a historian, and wrote some uniquely important work on the Holocaust. So, but I don't know if this was the general pattern. This is what I don't know. This is something I mentioned, that there are a lot of things that we don't really know about as historians about the Holocaust, and this is something that I think even if you went into libraries and exhausted the literature, you might not find an answer to this. This is something that I think historians should tell the full story of. So was the network you're talking about in Belgium, who exactly originated, who directed it? It requires careful coordination, something like that. It doesn't just happen, right? There had to be somebody behind it, church authorities or nuns, whoever it was. But you see the same sort of networks elsewhere. And on the background of 6 million, it doesn't seem like many, but we know that some of the women I was showing you, they rescued upwards of 2,500 children. And it was done through a coordinated effort through convents. So it wasn't limited to Belgium by any means. And as I said, when we're talking about this period, it's tough to find positive stories. So I think it's important to embrace them when we find them.
Oh yeah,
so
and that's
thanks
why
for mentioning this.
No, I definitely bring it up because of the. Obviously, they saved my mother's life. So without that, the story would have been a lot different. So.
Well, I'll just say one thing just to show you the complication of these matters is that one of these women who was involved in rescue operations, and this woman was very active in smuggling Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto, she was known as being an outright anti-Semite before something switched in her during the war. And I know the general reputation. There is literature about her, but I don't know why that happened. It'd be interesting to know more. Something changed during the war. But this engagement of these priests and nuns that you mentioned in Belgium must have also in some ways changed them. and it'd be interesting to know more about it. I just don't know.
Okay, I was just.
But I think any students here interested in an interesting, under-researched thing, I mean, I think should turn to this issue.
The last family where she was hidden in southern Belgium in the Ardennes, in a little town called Virton, they were atheists, and they hid her just because, they just felt it was the right thing to do.
But they were sent there by...
I don't know how she ended up going there. I really don't. They kept her in her basement. He was part of the resistance. He was a army Belgian officer in the Congo before the war and stuff like that.
That suggests to me that this is part of the resistance in general, of which the part of the church was a part, right? So these are resistors who happen to be Catholics and Catholics who happen to be resistors, something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
Let's allow
Okay,
for
thank you.
one last question.
Last question. So probably there is not much time, but you describe some of the influences of this intellectual, some of their historical trajectory. Both the historical trajectory and personal transformations in terms of the outlook. But can you tell something about the inner workings of the Catholic Church, especially in terms of the procedures that draw to the drawing of these documents? I mean, these people are influential, but to what extent? What were the bishops doing? How about the Pope? I mean, ultimately, it's the bishop who proclaimed this new outlook of the church and so on. So what was the exact procedure? Like, were these people asked by the Catholic Church to throw some ideas, to drop some proposals? Were the bishops theologically illiterate? Didn't they have any impact? How about the Pope at the time? So what was the exact procedure so that we can assess whether this was just these people or there were other elements? I presume there were all kinds of politics and other concerns that led to this. So, thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. So what happened, so the question was about the internal workings of the church bureaucracy, if you will. John the 23rd, when he became Pope in 1958, decided to call this council. He felt that the church had fallen behind, wasn't up to date. He wanted to bring the church up to date. He was thinking of modernity, of the challenge of living in modern society. And then, as I mentioned, this survivor, Julie Isaac, went and pleaded with him that the question of Jewish-Christian relations be included on the council's agenda. And when that happened, the Pope, John the 23rd, contacted a German cardinal named Augustin Bea from southwest Germany, BEA. He's actually featured on the propaganda that you got about this event. The poster, I think there's a postcard that was produced. It features actually Bea with the American Jewish thinker Abraham Joshua Heschel. So Bea was, he was an Old Testament scholar, very knowledgeable about theology, not knowledgeable about these issues. What he did is he assembled a committee of experts. So Österreicher was one of them, but there were others. There was a guy named Gregory Baum, recently died, whom I've gotten to know. He was an eminent theologian who worked in Canada, was himself of German Jewish background, but was his parents were Protestant, and he went with a Kindertransport. He was actually saved from Europe in the 30s and went on to become an eminent specialist in ecumenical affairs. So he was also one of the advisors. There's a whole group of them. There was one moment in 1964, I believe, where the people who were charged with a redraft of the document, all three of them were of Jewish background. So there were a lot of converts involved in this work as well. But what my view is, what happened is that I don't know what to compare this to, but maybe even a congressional committee would be like this, where if it's some technical issue, the congressmen have some idea about. Some of them are very smart. The senators may know something about it. They really do rely upon experts. So they turn the drafting entirely over to these people, to these priests, essentially, to these doctors in theology, to people like Österreicher and Baum and a couple of other. I mentioned them in my book. Were the bishops not themselves theologically literate? I think that most of them really didn't know this issue. That's my thesis. Some of them were more positive about it than others. So some of them had this positive sentiment. The American bishops, the German bishops in particular. So we have records, and I'm grateful to the Paulist order actually for making these records available to me. I've seen the memos of the discussions that the bishops had with the advisors present, and the German bishops are usually very forceful in demanding some kind of strong statement against anti-Semitism. And here's what they say, among other things. They say, we cannot be the church that is silent. We cannot be the church as portrayed by Rolf Hochhuth. Do you all know Hochhuth? So he was a Protestant, he was a playwright who wrote a play portraying Pius XII as being uncaring and silent, calculating, cold, negative. So this is something in Österreicher too, who had met Pius XII, was horrified by this vision, by this portrayal of Pius XII. So the German bishops in particular said in these internal meetings, we cannot let this continue to be the reputation of our church. So there was very strong kind of intellectual pressure behind the statement, but the actual wording, where to draw, for example, the formula about the end of time. Since we're approaching the end of this event, we can talk about the end of time. It was a major concern about how to portray this eschatological event, the ultimate joining of Christians and Jews with God in some way. Do Jews become Christians first? What's the order of this happening? And it was Karl Thieme who actually came upon a solution to this problem that's portrayed in the final document. It's from one of the minor prophets, Zephaniah, I believe, says something to the effect that the church looks forward to a day when all men will call upon God and serve him shoulder to shoulder. That's the eschatological statement. That was in some ways, that was the solution. That was something that Thieme came up with, reading a series of German theologians, Karl Barth being one of them, in the 1950s, right? So this is where this technical knowledge, finding the right formula for this document was crucial. And no bishop knew this stuff. Guarantee you, no bishop knew this stuff. So the bishops were there in sentiment, I think. That's why they raised their hands in agreement, 2,221 to 88, right? But whether they fully understood the ultimate impact is not clear, the ultimate implication. So that both Cardinal Bea, whom I mentioned is forming this committee, and the Pope himself, they said things soon after the council that indicated that they hadn't fully digested the meaning. The Pope in particular horrified people with statements that appeared to be anti-Judaic in 1965. So this like all history, this history is not over, and it continues to be a matter of concern for people inside and outside the church. And that's why I would urge you, if you're interested, to inform yourselves, to read things like Commonweal, which is a good Catholic liberal journal that I sometimes write for and read, or America, the Jesuit journal, and other similar Catholic Reporter. These are very good sources of information, but to keep yourselves informed, because otherwise things can revert to a very old tradition. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Connelly. Thank you all for being here. We have another program Thursday night this week in Ireland. Thank you.